The heavy oak door to the playroom bursts open with a thunderous slam. Richard Hale, the billionaire known for his cold precision in business, stands frozen at the threshold. His breath catches. His maid, Clara, is kneeling beside his young daughter, Emily, frail, delicate, bound to her wheelchair. Clara's arms are wrapped protectively around the child, her lips close to Emily's ear, whispering words too soft to catch. Richard's eyes blaze with fury. In his world, boundaries are everything. Rules are law. And right now, in his own home, he believes one of those rules has been broken. His fists clench at his sides. His mind races with suspicion. Emily clings to Clara, her small fingers gripping tightly as if afraid to let go. The sight twists Richard's heart, but pride and anger harden his face. What could a maid possibly be telling his daughter that requires such intimacy? What secret words are being shared behind his back? The air is thick with tension. Richard takes a step forward, and the warmth of the scene turns icy in an instant. He thought he caught the maid crossing a line, but the truth he discovered would shatter everything he believed. Before we continue, please kindly tell us where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Nup Stories for more stories like this. The Hale estate stretched wide like a palace, its towering walls whispering of wealth and power. The gates opened onto a driveway that seemed endless, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and glowing lanterns. Inside, marble floors gleamed beneath the glow of chandeliers, every surface polished to perfection, every corridor echoing with silence. From the outside, it was a fortress of success, the kind of home people dreamt of, but inside it was hollow. The air carried the weight of loneliness, as if the house itself mourned. At the center of it all stood Richard Hale, a man in his early 50s. His presence was sharp like the cut of his tailored suits. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly combed, his tie always perfectly knotted, as though order could protect him from chaos. His eyes, cold, calculating, the same eyes that had built billion-dollar companies, rarely softened. Once, long ago, they had shone with warmth, but grief had carved away that part of him. Widowed for years, Richard wore his pain like invisible armor, though he would never admit it. Business was his sanctuary, the boardroom his battlefield. Family, affection, tenderness. Those were luxuries he told himself he no longer needed. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, he left the mansion with a briefcase in hand and his phone pressed to his ear. His footsteps echoed briskly down the marble hall as if he were running from ghosts no one else could see. And every night, he returned late, the world outside already asleep. The house, too, lay wrapped in darkness. The staff had retired to their quarters, the kitchen lights dim, the grand staircase silent. Upstairs, his young daughter lay in her bed, the glow of her nightlight the only warmth in the mansion. Richard would pass her door, pausing for the briefest second, hand hovering near the doorknob, but he never turned it. Instead, he retreated to his study, drowning himself in reports and contracts. The mansion was a palace of power, but within its walls lived a king without a kingdom, a man who had everything money could buy, yet lacked the one thing his daughter needed most, his presence. And somewhere in that silence, an unseen bond was beginning to form, one that would soon challenge everything Richard thought he knew. 8-year-old Emily Hale lived within that silence. Her laughter was a rare sound in the house, as rare as her father's smile. When it did escape, it fluttered down the hallways like a fragile bird, beautiful, fleeting, almost out of place against the cold marble walls. Confined to a wheelchair, Emily's body was delicate, but her spirit burned bright. Her big, curious eyes often wandered to the window, where sunlight spilled across her small hands. She loved coloring books, fairy tales, and watching the golden dust dance in the morning beams. Sometimes she imagined those floating specks of light were fairies, sent to keep her company when no one else did. But most of all, Emily loved affection. She craved it the way flowers reach for the sun, instinctively, desperately, as though her very survival depended on it. And in a mansion where servants bowed politely, scurried efficiently, but never lingered long enough to listen, affection was in dangerously short supply. Her father gave her everything money could buy, handmade dolls from Paris, dresses lined with silk, even a playroom larger than most people's homes. Yet what she wanted most wasn't wrapped in ribbon. It wasn't expensive or rare. It was simple. A hug at bedtime, someone to listen to her stories, someone to whisper, "I love you." She remembered faintly the warmth of her mother's embrace, though those memories grew softer with each passing year, like photos fading under the sun. Sometimes she would close her eyes tightly, trying to hold on to the sound of her mother's laughter, the gentle rhythm of her lullabies. But even memory had its limits, and Emily, still so young, was left clutching at shadows. At night, when the mansion creaked with emptiness, she would sit in her wheelchair by the window, whispering secrets to the moon. "Do you think Daddy still loves me?" she'd ask softly, as if the stars might answer. The truth was painful. Richard loved his daughter deeply, but he didn't know how to show it. To Emily, it felt like abandonment. To Richard, it felt like survival. Between them stretched a canyon of unspoken words, and so Emily waited. Waited for a smile, a touch, a moment of warmth. Little did she know, her yearning heart would soon draw someone into her life, someone who would fill the silence with laughter, and whose presence would spark a storm that could either heal or destroy. The Hale family forever. That's where Clara entered. In her early 30s, Clara was not like the polished staff who had worked at the Hale estate for years. She was new, quiet, and carried herself with the weight of someone who had seen much more of life than she let on. Her dark skin and quiet determination often drew whispers from the other maids, whose manicured hands barely touched the work Clara threw herself into. While others dusted lightly or polished absent-mindedly, Clara scrubbed until her knuckles ached, polished until surfaces gleamed, and carried loads twice as heavy as she should. But it wasn't her strength that stood out. It was something softer, something deeper. The way her eyes lit up when she saw Emily, the way her voice softened as if speaking to something precious. Unlike the others, Clara didn't treat Emily as if she were fragile glass, waiting to shatter. She didn't wince at the wheelchair or pity her small curled legs. She knelt down to Emily's level, looked her in the eyes, and spoke as though Emily were whole. And for Emily, that made all the difference. Clara's laughter was soft, like a secret melody carried on a breeze. Yet it was contagious, a sound so rare in the Hale estate that even the marble walls seemed to hum with it when she laughed. For the first time in a long while, Emily began to laugh too, and the sound, though small, was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Still, Clara carried something else with her, an air of mystery that lingered no matter how kind her smile. She rarely spoke of her past. The other staff would sometimes gossip in the kitchen. Where had she come from? Why did she never mention family? Clara's lips would tighten, her eyes lowering as she focused on scrubbing or folding laundry, as if silence was safer than truth. Every so often, when she thought no one was watching, her expression would shift. The softness would give way to a heavy sorrow, like the shadow of a wound that hadn't healed. Once Emily caught her gazing out of the playroom window, a single tear sliding down her cheek. When Clara noticed the child watching, she quickly smiled, but Emily never forgot. To Emily, Clara became more than a maid. She was comfort, laughter, and warmth. To Richard, however, Clara was becoming something dangerous, too close. And in the stillness of the Hale mansion, that closeness would soon spark questions Richard could no longer ignore. Richard noticed. For a man who built his empire by catching details others overlooked, nothing escaped his eye in his own home. He saw the way Emily's face lit up when Clara entered the room. He noticed how his daughter's laughter, sound so rare it almost startled him, came easier when Clara was near. He noticed Clara's hand brushing gently through Emily's hair, or the way her voice lingered on bedtime stories, weaving pictures in Emily's imagination that stretched far beyond the pages. And Richard did not like it. Clara was a maid, a servant. Her role was to clean, to maintain order, not to entangle herself in the fragile world of his daughter's heart. To Richard, affection was dangerous. It blurred the lines between duty and intimacy, and blurred lines, he believed, were the cracks where betrayal seeped in. So his tone with Clara grew colder. His instructions clipped, sharp like the edge of a knife. Gratitude was a currency he never spent on her. When she polished the silver, he ran a finger along it, searching for spots. When she folded laundry, he unfolded a shirt, finding a crease to frown at. He inspected her work with the scrutiny of a judge waiting for a guilty verdict. Yet Clara never pushed back. She bowed her head slightly, nodded, and worked harder. Her resilience was quiet but steady, like a flame refusing to be snuffed out. Every order he barked, she obeyed. Every disapproving glance she endured. And still, when Richard's back was turned, she knelt beside Emily, whispering stories or pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. That, more than anything, unsettled Richard. It wasn't just defiance, it was devotion. Devotion Emily clung to. Devotion Richard had withheld for years, convincing himself that distance was strength. One evening, as Richard passed by Emily's bedroom, he paused at the door. Clara sat at his daughter's side, the lamplight catching her face as she tucked the blankets around. Emily with almost maternal care. Emily's voice, small and tender, drifted into the hall. "I love you, Mommy." Richard froze. His chest tightened, anger and confusion colliding in waves. Clara's head dropped, her hands trembling against the blanket. She whispered something he couldn't catch. Richard stepped back into the shadows, jaw clenched, suspicion burning hotter than ever. What was Clara hiding? Why was Emily calling her Mommy? For Richard Hale, questions were always weapons, and now, for the first time, those questions were turning against him. The rain came down in sheets, pounding the mansion's tall windows like 1,000 tiny fists. Thunder rumbled low across the sky, its echo rolling through the empty halls. The vast estate, usually silent, now felt even lonelier, as if the storm itself was trying to break through the walls. Emily sat by the window in her wheelchair, her small hands fidgeting nervously against the wooden armrests. She stared at the streaks of water racing down the glass, her lips trembling. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she breathed, "I wish Mommy was here." Clara froze. She had been dusting the shelves with practiced precision, her motions steady and quiet, blending into the background the way all staff were expected to. But those words, soft, aching, fragile, pulled her forward. Slowly, she set the cloth aside and moved to Emily's side. Kneeling so her eyes met the little girl's, Clara placed a warm, gentle hand over Emily's trembling fingers. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of empathy. "I know, but you're not alone. Not while I'm here." Emily's wide eyes glistened, tears gathering like the raindrops on the window. She tried to blink them back, but one escaped, tracing a delicate line down her cheek. Clara didn't wait. She reached out and pulled the girl into her arms, holding her tightly as though shielding her from the storm outside. For a moment Emily resisted, her small body stiff. But then, like a lock giving way, she melted into Clara's chest. Her arms clutched tightly around Clara's neck, her sobs muffled against the fabric of her uniform. Each shudder of Emily's fragile frame pierced Clara's heart. She rocked her gently, her hand smoothing the child's hair, as she whispered words of comfort. Only a child's soul could truly understand. "You're safe," Clara murmured. "I've got you always." The storm outside raged on, but inside Clara's embrace, Emily found calm. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt warmth, not from blankets or the fireplace, but from being truly seen. In that moment, Clara wasn't just the maid. She wasn't just a servant in the Hale mansion. She was something far more, something Emily desperately yearned for. Love, safety, family. Emily's sobs softened into hiccups, then into quiet breaths. She tilted her face upward, her voice fragile but certain. "I love you, Mommy." Clara's eyes widened, her heart clenching. She pressed a trembling kiss to Emily's forehead, unable to answer. For deep down, she knew the truth, and Emily's words ran deeper than either of them could yet reveal. Weeks slipped by, and with them came the day that should have been filled with joy, Emily's 8th birthday. The mansion awoke to the buzz of preparations. Staff rushed about with trays of crystal glasses, arranging gold-trimmed plates, and setting out the towering cake that looked more like a sculpture than something meant to be eaten. Ribbons of satin shimmered under the chandeliers, and the dining hall glowed with a sterile sort of grandeur, perfect for magazine covers. But what it lacked was the one thing Emily longed for most: laughter. There were no squeals of friends running through the hallways, no balloons bobbing at the ceiling, no games or music filling the air. It was a birthday built for display, not delight. Emily sat in her wheelchair at the head of the long table, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the silk dress her father had chosen, its delicate fabric catching the light, but her eyes were dull. She stared at the ornate cake, 8 tiny candles waiting to be lit, but her lips did not curve into a smile. Clara had noticed earlier, the way Emily's shoulders drooped, the way her gaze lingered longingly at the door as if wishing anyone would come through to share the day. Clara's heart ached. She couldn't bring friends or fill the mansion with laughter, but she could give Emily something real. So, while the rest of the staff busied themselves with silverware and crystal, Clara slipped quietly into Emily's room. From her pocket, she pulled out a folded piece of paper. On its front was a shaky heart, drawn with uneven crayon strokes, red bleeding into pink, surrounded by small stars. Inside, in Clara's careful handwriting, it read, "Happy birthday, Emily. You are loved." When Emily opened it, her entire face transformed. Her eyes lit up brighter than any candle waiting downstairs. She clutched the card to her chest and looked at Clara with a smile that could have melted marble. "This," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with joy, "this is the best present." She threw her arms around Clara, hugging her as tightly as her little body allowed. For a fleeting moment, the mansion's cold walls seemed to disappear, replaced by warmth only love could give. Later, when Richard entered the dining hall, he paused at the sight before him. Emily, radiant in her chair, clutching that homemade card as though it were treasure. His eyes narrowed. Extravagance had been ignored, his carefully planned spectacle reduced to a crayon heart. He frowned, suspicion flickering in his gaze. Another boundary crossed, and for Richard Hale that was something he could not ignore. The days in the mansion grew heavier, as though the air itself carried the weight of unspoken accusations. Richard's suspicion had taken root like ivy on stone, creeping into every corner of his mind. Every laugh Emily shared with Clara, every whispered bedtime story, every smile that didn't belong to him stung like betrayal. He told himself it was caution, not jealousy, A billionaire's life left little room for trust, and Richard had built his empire by expecting the worst in people. Business partners lied, friends turned opportunists. Even family had fractured under the strain of wealth. Why should this maid be any different? One evening he lingered by Emily's room longer than usual. The sound of Clara's voice carried through the half-open door. Gentle, melodic, soothing. Emily's small giggles followed, and Richard felt something inside him twist. It wasn't just affection. To his mind, it was possession. Clara was staking a claim on his daughter's heart. At dinner that night, the tension finally cracked. Richard's fork clattered against his plate as he fixed Clara with a sharp, piercing stare. "Why does Emily call you her favorite?" His voice was low, but the words sliced the room in two. Clara froze, caught between the authority of her employer and the innocence of a child's love. She lowered her gaze, steadying herself before answering. "Because I listen to her, sir," she said softly. "That's all she wants." The answer was simple, honest. Yet to Richard it was barbed. Insolence disguised as humility. His jaw tightened, the muscle twitching beneath his skin. To him it wasn't about listening. It was about control. And Clara had stepped too far into territory that belonged to him. He said nothing more, only pushed back his chair and stood abruptly. His footsteps echoed down the hall, but his silence was louder than any outburst. Clara exhaled slowly, her hands trembling just slightly as she cleared the dishes. Emily watched her father's retreat with confusion, her young eyes flickering between the two adults she depended on most. That night, Richard lay awake in his cavernous bedroom, the shadows pooling around him. He told himself he was protecting Emily, from disappointment, from manipulation, from a stranger who had slipped too easily into their lives. But beneath that shield of suspicion lurked a quieter, more dangerous truth he refused to face. He was jealous, and jealousy once ignited rarely burned without destruction. What Richard failed to notice, or perhaps refused to see, was the invisible thread weaving between Clara and Emily, stronger with each passing day. It was in the small moments, the ones too quiet for a businessman always rushing from call to call. Clara was the one who knelt beside Emily's wheelchair in the garden, pointing out how the roses opened to the sun or how the sparrows dipped and soared like dancers in the air. Richard only saw his neatly manicured estate. Emily saw a world blooming because Clara taught her how to look. When night fell and the house grew cold with silence, Clara's presence became even more vital. She spun tales of queens who led armies with kindness, of warriors who fought not for power, but for love. Her voice was a lantern in the dark, and Emily clung to it as though it kept nightmares away. Each story was a promise that strength didn't always come from muscles or money. It could come from love, from loyalty, from faith. It was Clara Emily trusted with the questions she couldn't voice to her father. "Will I ever walk again? Why do I feel lonely when the house is full of people?" Clara never dismissed her fears. Instead, she listened, really listened, and that alone made Emily feel less invisible. On the nights when Richard stayed late at the office, Clara would pull the blankets gently up to Emily's chin. She'd smooth the girl's hair, stroke her cheek with the tenderness of someone who knew exactly how much touch could heal. And just before stepping away, she'd lean close and whisper, as if sealing the night with a blessing, "You are never alone, little one." Sometimes Emily, half lost in dreams, would stir, her lips curving faintly as she murmured back, "I love you, Mommy." The first time Clara heard it, she froze. The word hit her like a tremor, soft yet earth-shattering. Her chest tightened, her eyes burned, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. But she didn't correct Emily. She didn't remind her that she was only the maid. Instead, she pressed a trembling kiss to the girl's forehead and whispered, "I love you too." Unseen in the shadows of the mansion, a family was being stitched together in secret, one bedtime whisper at a time. What Richard didn't know was that Emily had already found the love she was missing. And what Clara didn't know was that Richard was on the verge of discovering this secret bond. It happened on a night like any other, at least that's how it began. Richard, returning late as always, moved down the hallway with his usual precision. His shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, his mind still replaying numbers from the day's deals. He intended to go straight to his study, pour a glass of scotch, and bury himself in work until dawn. But as he neared Emily's room, something made him pause. A murmur, a soft rhythmic voice. He frowned. At this hour, Emily should have been asleep. Curiosity drew him closer, and he pressed against the wall, leaning toward the faint glow spilling from the slightly open door. Through the narrow gap, the scene unfolded like a betrayal laid bare. Clara sat on the edge of Emily's bed, her posture tender, her hands smoothing the blanket with a care that felt too intimate. Emily's small arms reached up, circling Clara's neck, pulling her close in an embrace that seemed practiced, natural. And then the words that shattered Richard's carefully built armor and pierced through his heart like a blade. "I love you, Mommy." Richard's breath snagged in his throat. His chest tightened, fury clawing its way up as disbelief clouded his mind. "Mommy?" Clara froze for a heartbeat, her face hidden from him, then lowered her head closer to Emily, whispering something Richard couldn't catch. Emily's tiny body relaxed, her eyes closing in contentment, as if nothing in the world was missing anymore. But to Richard, everything was wrong, twisted, unacceptable. In his mind, this wasn't affection, it was trespass. It was an outsider daring to step into sacred territory, a maid stealing the one role that belonged to his late wife, the one memory Richard had clung to when grief tried to break him. He stumbled back into the shadows, his heart pounding, his fists curling. Rage burned hot, but beneath it was something colder. Fear. Fear that he was losing his daughter. Not to death, not to illness, but to someone who didn't belong. His world tilted. The marble beneath him felt unsteady, as though the mansion itself had betrayed him. Richard didn't confront them that night. He turned away, jaw clenched, retreating silently into the dark. But in his mind, a storm had already begun to gather. And this was only the beginning. The days at the Hale mansion grew heavier, though no one dared speak it aloud. The walls seemed to listen, the silence carrying Richard, Hale's suspicions, like smoke that lingered long after a fire. Richard had always been a man who trusted no one, not in business, not in life. And now, within his own home, that mistrust festered like a poison. He watched Clara with the eyes of a hawk, every interaction between her and Emily feeding his unease. At first, it was small things, moments so subtle they could have been dismissed as coincidence. Clara laughing with Emily during a game of cards, Emily refusing to eat unless Clara sat beside her. The way his daughter's fragile smile appeared brighter, fuller whenever Clara entered the room. To Richard, it wasn't bonding, it was control. He told himself Clara was weaving herself into his daughter's heart, creating a dependency that could later be used against him. It wasn't love, he reasoned. It was strategy. And if there was one thing Richard Hale knew, it was strategy. At night, he replayed moments in his head until sleep became impossible. Emily clutching the handmade birthday card. Emily calling Clara Mommy. Emily reaching for Clara instead of him. Each memory was like a knife twisting slowly, a reminder that his daughter was slipping further from his grasp, and he didn't know how to stop it. The unease began to bleed into his daily routine. During dinners, his eyes lingered too long on Clara as she poured water or adjusted Emily's napkin. In the garden, he pretended to read the newspaper while watching her push Emily's wheelchair along the gravel path. Even the servants noticed his constant vigilance, though no one dared to comment. Richard began to see Clara everywhere, in Emily's laughter, in her defiance, in the tiny spark of joy that hadn't existed before Clara arrived. Instead of feeling grateful, he felt robbed. Clara was becoming the light in Emily's life, and that light should have belonged to him alone. Yet beneath the suspicion was something far more dangerous, fear. For all his wealth and power, Richard Hale had no idea how to reach his daughter. Money had built her a fortress, but it couldn't touch her heart. Clara, with nothing but gentle words and warm eyes, had walked straight through the gates. One evening, Richard lingered by Emily's bedroom door again. He heard Clara's soft voice drifting out, telling a story about queens and warriors, about bravery and love. He listened as Emily giggled, then murmured, "Good night, Mommy." The sound froze him in place. Richard's jaw tightened, rage boiling beneath the surface. But deeper than rage was something he would never admit, jealousy. Clara had stolen the place he thought was rightfully his. In the shadows of the mansion, suspicion became obsession. And obsession, Richard knew, was only ever the beginning of war. But then, Emily's health brought the tension into sharper focus. It began subtly, almost invisible at first. She would grow tired more quickly, her voice losing its spark after just a few words. Her tiny hands trembled when she tried to draw, the crayon slipping from her fingers more often than not. Clara, ever watchful, was the first to notice, her brow creasing with worry as Emily leaned against her, shoulder after even the simplest tasks. Richard, refusing to ignore the signs, summoned the family physician. The man had cared for Emily since birth, and his presence always filled the mansion with a quiet authority. He examined Emily carefully, listening to her breathing, checking her pulse, watching how quickly she fatigued. His expression was thoughtful, measured, but there was a heaviness in his eyes when he finally asked Richard to step aside. "She's physically stable for now," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses, his tone careful. "But stability does not mean strength. What concerns me most isn't her body, it's her spirit." Richard frowned. "Her spirit?" "Yes," the doctor continued. "Children like Emily. They live not just on medicine, but on meaning. Loneliness, emotional isolation, it worsens her condition. Connection, affection, those are as vital as any prescription. Without them, her body may weaken further. The words stung Richard more than he let on. Loneliness? Emotional isolation? He had given Emily everything: world-class doctors, elite tutors, a mansion filled with beauty and safety. What more could a child need? His mind rebelled against the idea that money wasn't enough. But when Richard glanced back into the room, the sting turned into something far sharper. Emily was quietly resting in her chair, her eyelids heavy, her breathing soft, and beside her, humming a gentle tune, sat Clara. Emily's small hand rested trustingly in hers, their connection unspoken yet undeniable. The doctor's words echoed relentlessly, "She needs connection, affection." Richard's chest tightened. That was the very thing Emily had found in Clara, and it was the one thing he could not give, no matter how hard he tried. Later that evening, Richard lingered in the hallway as he heard Clara's voice drifting from Emily's room. She was singing, her tone low and soothing, almost like a lullaby. Emily's soft giggle followed, then a whisper, "Don't leave me, Clara." Richard froze. His knuckles tightened against the wall, anger and helplessness colliding. Clara had become Emily's anchor, her medicine, her comfort. And that meant if Clara was ever taken away, Emily's fragile health might collapse entirely. It was a terrifying thought. For Richard, this wasn't just about jealousy anymore. It wasn't only about boundaries or pride. Now Clara's presence seemed entwined with Emily's very survival. And for a man who thrived on control, nothing was more dangerous than realizing the one thing keeping his daughter alive was the one person he no longer trusted. That night, Richard tried. It wasn't in his nature to try with feelings. Numbers, contracts, deals, those he understood. But the doctor's words had lodged in his mind like a splinter. She needs connection, affection. He entered Emily's room after dinner, his footsteps unusually hesitant on the polished floors. The scent of crayons and paper lingered in the air. Emily sat in her wheelchair near the desk, her small hand moving shakily across the page, filling it with uneven colors. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost unrecognizable even to himself. "How are you feeling?" She looked up, surprised. For a moment, her pale face brightened at the sound of his attention. "Tired, but Clara read me a story. That made me feel better." Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of Clara, but he forced a smile that felt foreign on his lips. He approached, lowering himself to one knee beside her chair, eye level with her fragile form. "I can read to you too, if you'd like." Emily hesitated. Her little fingers clutched the crayon tighter as if weighing something important. Her big, innocent eyes searched his face as though hunting for truth. And then, in a voice so delicate it cut sharper than a blade, she whispered, "Daddy, why don't you hug me like Clara does?" The question struck like lightning. His throat went dry. The air seemed to leave the room. He blinked, struggling for words he had never prepared. I don't," he stumbled, his usual certainty dissolving. "I provide for you, Emily. I make sure you have everything you need." Her eyes filled with tears, her little lips trembling. "I don't want everything, Daddy. I just want you." Her voice cracked, and with it, something deep inside Richard cracked too. For the first time in years, the fortress he had built around his heart trembled. Images flashed in his mind. His late wife's smile, her gentle way of holding Emily, how she had once told him, "Children don't measure love in gifts, Richard. They measure it in touch." He had ignored her then, burying himself in empire building. Now those words came back to haunt him. Emily's tears slid down her cheeks, small and quiet, yet louder than any storm. Richard's hands hovered uselessly above her, twitching as if to hold her, but his pride froze him. Vulnerability to him was weakness, and weakness had no place in his world. Instead, he forced his hand to pat hers, awkward, cold, inadequate. Then he stood abruptly, his chest heavy, his heart torn between duty and fear. He left the room before his walls shattered completely. Behind him, the sound he dreaded most filled the silence. Emily's quiet sobs, muffled against her coloring book. Richard paused in the hallway, his back pressed to the wall, his fists clenched. He wanted to return, to do what Clara did so effortlessly. But the distance between wanting and doing felt like an ocean. And in that gap of silence, something dangerous began to grow. Emily's sadness deepened, and Richard's guilt hardened into a fear he would not yet admit. The next morning, Richard rose earlier than usual, his mind still restless from Emily's broken voice the night before. Sleep had not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter's tears and Clara's name on her lips. When he entered the kitchen, the smell of butter and warm porridge filled the air. Clara stood at the counter, carefully stirring Emily's breakfast, humming softly to herself. The domestic calm of the scene enraged him, as if she belonged here, as if this were her home. His anger, simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. "You're getting too close," Richard snapped, his voice sharp as shattered glass. The suddenness of his tone made Clara freeze. her hand clutching the wooden spoon mid-stir. "Sir," she said cautiously, her voice soft but steady. "You're confusing her, Clara," Richard barked, stepping forward. "She's calling you things she shouldn't. Things you have no right to hear from her." Clara's lips parted slightly and her eyes glistened. But instead of shrinking, she straightened her posture, clutching the spoon as if it gave her strength. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She needs comfort. She needs love. That's not confusion, it's survival." Richard's jaw tightened. The word love struck him like an insult. His chest tightened as he moved closer, his shadow falling long and heavy across the counter. "You're a maid, Clara," he said coldly. "Not her mother. Don't overstep again." Silence clung to the kitchen for a moment. The porridge bubbled softly, the only sound between them. Then Clara, with surprising boldness, met his gaze. "If giving a child a hug is overstepping," she whispered, her voice breaking but determined, "then maybe you should ask yourself why she needs it from me and not from you." The words landed like a blade. Richard's face hardened instantly, his pride bleeding beneath the surface. His fists curled at his sides, the sharp sting of truth threatening to break through his armor. For a moment, he had no reply, only the echo of his daughter's question. "Why don't you hug me like Clara does?" "Watch yourself," he growled at last, his tone low and dangerous. "You're here for work, not to play family. If this continues, you won't be here at all." Clara's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she turned back to the stove, stirring again as if the motion could hold her together. She didn't answer, but her silence was louder than any words. It carried defiance, sorrow, and a quiet warning Richard couldn't ignore. He stared at her back, fury clashing with an unsettling fear that perhaps Clara had said out loud the one truth he had been running from. For the first time, Richard wasn't sure who was truly in control, the powerful billionaire, or the maid with his daughter's heart. Weeks passed, and the Hale mansion seemed to hold its breath. Conversations were clipped. Footsteps echoed too loudly in the marble halls. Even Emily, young as she was, sensed the tension. She clung to Clara more fiercely, as though some invisible force might rip her away. One evening, Richard strode into the playroom, trying to distract himself with fatherly duty. The room was cluttered with crayons scattered across the floor, half-finished drawings and little paper cutouts. Emily sat hunched over her table, her fragile frame bent low, hair falling into her eyes as she concentrated. "Emily," Richard began, his voice meant to be casual, though it came out stern. He picked up one of the papers lying on the floor. The breath caught in his chest. His stomach twisted. The page showed Emily in her wheelchair, her stick-thin arms reaching out, holding hands with Clara. Above them, in unsteady, uneven letters, read two words that pierced him like a dagger: "Mommy Clara." Richard's hand trembled as he held the drawing. His blood roared in his ears, boiling hotter with every second. "Emily?" The name burst out, sharper than he intended, like the crack of a whip. She startled violently, the crayon slipping from her little fingers. Her wide eyes lifted to him, already glistening with fear. What did I do wrong?" Richard's fist clenched around the paper, his voice shaking with fury and disbelief. He waved the drawing in the air as if it were proof of betrayal. This right here! She's not your mother!" "She never will be." Emily's eyes brimmed instantly, her lips trembling as though the weight of his words crushed her chest. Tears spilled down her cheeks hot and fast. But she loves me like a mommy does," she whispered, her voice breaking into sobs. "Why can't you?" The question struck like a spear. Richard froze, his chest burning, not just with anger, but with something deeper, rawer. Shame, a guilt he couldn't name. But pride was stronger than compassion. He couldn't admit weakness, not even to his own child. Instead, he crushed the paper in his fist and stormed out of the room, his footsteps pounding down the hall like thunder. Behind him, Emily sobbed into her hands. She picked up the crumpled drawing from the floor, smoothing it with trembling fingers. Hugging it to her chest, she whispered through her tears, "Mommy Clara loves me." And though no one heard it, those words planted a seed Richard could no longer ignore. The storm outside rattled the mansion's windows, but Richard barely noticed. He paced his study, glass in hand, thoughts circling like vultures. Emily's words still echoed in his mind. "Why can't you?" He gritted his teeth, refusing to feel the sting. But it lingered, cutting deeper than he cared to admit. As he strode into the hall to clear his mind, something caught his eye. A bundle of linens rested on a chair, folded neatly. Odd. Clara was meticulous, never leaving her duties unfinished. Richard frowned, stepping closer. Among the folded fabric, half hidden, was a small, worn envelope. The edges were frayed, the paper softened with age. For a long moment, Richard hovered, torn between respect for privacy and the gnawing need to know. Curiosity won. He slid the envelope out, the weight of secrets pressing into his palm. Slowly he opened it. Inside were letters, old, faded, their ink smudged but still legible. His eyes skimmed the words, phrases leaping out like flames. My dearest. I'll protect her always, even if it means sacrifice. His brow furrowed. Protect who? At the bottom of the bundle lay a photograph, its edges curled. Richard lifted it, and his pulse thundered in his ears. It was Clara, younger, her face softer but unmistakable. In her arms she cradled a baby swaddled in a pale blanket. And that baby, Richard's chest tightened. The child's features were hauntingly familiar. The curve of the lips, the wide searching eyes, a mirror of Emily's face. His breath quickened. His mind raced. Whose baby was this? Clara's? Had she lost a child? Or worse, was she plotting to make Emily her replacement? He stared at the photograph until his knuckles whitened. Doubts swarmed, paranoia sharpening every thought. Clara wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just affectionate. She was hiding something that could upend everything. He shoved the envelope back among the linens as hurried footsteps echoed from down the hall. Clara's voice, humming softly, drifted nearer. Richard stepped into the shadows, his heartbeat pounding like a drum. In that moment, one thing was clear. This woman carried a past he knew nothing about. And until he uncovered it, he could not trust her. Not with his home, not with Emily, not with anything. The mystery had only just begun. The rain hammered against the tall windows, lightning splitting the night sky as if the heavens themselves bore witness. The mansion's corridors glowed dimly in the flicker of candlelight, shadows stretching long and uneasy. Richard stormed through the hall, fists clenched around the photograph that had been tormenting him. Since the moment he discovered it, his steps echoed like thunder until he found Clara carrying a tray of folded laundry. Enough, he barked, shoving the photo in her face. What is this? Who is this child? Clara froze. The tray rattled in her trembling hands. Her eyes flicked to the photograph, and in an instant, all color drained from her face. Her lips parted as if to answer, but only silence fell between them. Tell me, Richard roared, his voice booming through the hallway. Tell me the truth, Clara. Tears welled in her eyes, but she stood rigid, caught between fear and defiance. Before she could find the words, a small, fragile voice cut through the storm of their argument. Daddy, stop! Richard turned. Emily, pale and fragile, had wheeled herself into the hallway, her little hands gripping the wheels tightly. Her eyes shimmered with panic. Don't yell at her! His chest heaved, his fury blazing like wildfire. Emily, you don't understand. She's hiding things from us. She's not who you think she is. He waved the photograph, his knuckles white. She's a liar. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts. You're wrong, she cried, her voice trembling but fierce. She loves me. She takes care of me. Why can't you see that? Her words hit Richard harder than he expected, but pride kept his anger alive. Love? That's not love, Emily. That's manipulation. She's making you depend on her. No! Emily's shout cracked into sobs. Her small body shook violently. You don't understand! The shouting, the fear, the storm outside. It all converged into a breaking point. Emily's little hands quivered, her lips trembling as her face drained of color. Then, with a soft, broken gasp, her head lolled forward. Her body slumped in the chair, her eyes fluttering shut. Emily! Clara screamed, the tray clattering to the ground as she darted forward, catching the child before she toppled. She shook Emily gently, tears spilling down her cheeks. Stay with me, baby, please. Richard's heart stopped. The world around him seemed to collapse into silence, except for the pounding of his own pulse. The photograph slipped from his hand, floating down like a feather and landing uselessly at his feet. No, Emily, he whispered, stumbling forward. His knees buckled as he reached for her hand, cold and small in his own. For the first time, his anger vanished, swallowed whole by terror. Pride, suspicion, rage, none of it mattered now. Only one thought screamed through his mind. I may have lost her. The storm raged on outside, but inside the Hale mansion, a far greater storm had begun. The storm outside hadn't eased, but inside the ambulance it felt even louder. The pounding of Richard's heart, the rasp of Clara's desperate prayers, the shrill siren slicing through the night. Emily lay between them, fragile and motionless, her skin pale against the stark white of the stretcher. Richard's hands trembled on his knees. He wanted to shove Clara away, to accuse her of causing this collapse. Yet every time he glanced at Emily's tiny hand clutched inside Clara's, his anger faltered. All he saw was his daughter slipping through his fingers. This is my fault, he thought, though he couldn't bring himself to speak the words. At the hospital, the chaos was instant. Doors burst open, gurneys rolled, voices shouted orders. A team of doctors and nurses whisked Emily into intensive care before Richard could breathe her name. Clara's hand lingered in Emily's until the very last moment, her whispered prayer cut short as the doors slammed closed. Then silence. A brutal, suffocating silence. Richard and Clara sat in the waiting room, opposite ends of a long, sterile bench, a gulf of unspoken blame stretching between them. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting harsh shadows over Richard's hollow face. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her lips moving in silent pleas to a god who seemed too far away. Hours dragged on like centuries. Every time footsteps echoed down the hall, Richard's heart leapt, only to crash again when the staff passed by without stopping. His mind replayed Emily's trembling body, her voice crying, "Why don't you hug me like Clara does?" He swallowed hard, shame burning in his throat. Clara's quiet sobs filled the void. For once, Richard didn't tell her to stop. He didn't have the strength. Finally, the doctor appeared, exhaustion written across his face. Both Richard and Clara jumped to their feet, desperate for any crumb of news. "She's stable," the doctor said at last, his voice steady but firm. "But she's fragile. Her body cannot endure this kind of emotional strain. She needs peace, not conflict. Too much stress is dangerous for her heart." Richard nodded numbly, words caught in his throat. He should have felt relief, but guilt weighed heavier than joy. Clara turned her face away, burying it in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The storm outside rolled on. But in Richard's chest a darker storm brewed, one of guilt, suspicion, and a dawning realization. If he didn't change, he might not only lose Clara, he would lose Emily forever. The hospital had grown eerily quiet. The storm outside had faded into a steady drizzle, but inside, the sterile white halls seemed endless, every tick of the clock loud enough to echo. Richard couldn't sit in the waiting room any longer. His nerves were shredded, his chest tight with guilt, anger, and a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. His footsteps echoed as he wandered, aimless, down a dim corridor. That's when he heard it. A voice, soft but trembling, breaking through the silence. Clara's voice. He froze. It was coming from the small chapel tucked into the corner of the hospital. Curious, wary, he crept closer, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the faint glow of candlelight flickered against the walls. Clara knelt at the altar, her hands clasped tightly around a crumpled handkerchief. Her back was bowed as if carrying an invisible weight. Her whisper was so fragile, yet it cut through Richard's chest like glass. "I never wanted her to suffer like I did." Clara breathed, her words shaking with held-back sobs. "God, please, don't let her feel the pain I felt growing up." "Not her, not Emily." Richard's breath caught. His blood turned to ice. He pressed himself against the wall, staying in the shadows, afraid to be seen, yet unable to walk away. His mind raced. What did she mean? What pain? What suffering? Clara lifted her face toward the altar, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "She deserves love. A real family. Not the loneliness I knew. Not the abandonment. Don't let history repeat itself with her. Not Emily." Richard's jaw clenched. The words twisted in his chest, confusing him, stirring something he didn't want to name. Loneliness, abandonment, history repeating. Every word felt like a breadcrumb, leading to a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Was Clara confessing? Hiding some dark past? Did she have a child of her own? Was Emily just a replacement for someone she'd already lost? Or was it something more dangerous? His hand trembled as he gripped the chapel doorframe. Part of him wanted to storm in, demand answers, tear the truth from her lips. But another part, an unfamiliar, unsettling part, hesitated. For the first time, Richard felt something beyond anger toward Clara. He felt fear, not fear of her, but of what her words might mean. If Clara carried a past filled with secrets, with abandonment and pain, what did that mean for Emily? For him? Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard took a step back into the shadows, his heart pounding so loud it threatened to give him away. He didn't want to hear more. Not now. Not like this. The questions clawed at him, louder than the thunder had been, sharper than any argument. What suffering had Clara endured? What was she hiding? And why, despite himself, did a part of him believe her prayers were genuine? Richard turned and walked away, but the words followed him like ghosts. Not Emily, not her. The hospital corridors were silent except for the distant hum of machines and the faint beeping of monitors from behind closed doors. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Richard paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the sterile tiles like a metronome of unease. Clara's words from the chapel looped in his mind, refusing to fade. I never wanted her to suffer like I did. The statement gnawed at him. What suffering? What scars did Clara carry that made her voice tremble with such raw pain? And why was Emily the one she was so desperate to shield? Richard stopped, pressing his palms against the cold wall as if bracing himself. He had built empires by reading people, by spotting deception in boardrooms filled with smiling liars. Yet here he was, standing in a hospital hallway, unable to decide if Clara was an angel holding his daughter together, or a stranger weaving herself into his family's cracks. For the first time, doubt pierced his anger. The certainty that had fueled his accusations felt fragile now, almost childish. He remembered Emily clutching Clara's hand with desperate trust, calling her Mommy Clara with a love that had stung him more than any insult. Had he misjudged her? Or was this all part of some dangerous manipulation? His instincts screamed caution. Don't trust her. Protect Emily. Control the narrative. That was the voice of Richard Hale, the businessman, the empire builder who never let anyone slip past his armor. But beneath that, buried under years of pride and distance, something deeper stirred, something fatherly. A fragile, guilty voice whispered, "What if she's what Emily truly needs? What if you're the one failing her?" The thought was unbearable. Richard's hand tightened around the photo he had shoved into his pocket. Earlier, the one of Clara, younger, cradling that baby. The baby's eyes, hauntingly familiar, seemed to stare at him through the glossy paper even now. Every time he looked at it, the same chill crept down his spine. He needed answers. No more shadows. No more whispered prayers in empty chapels. Clara was hiding something, and whether it was innocence or betrayal, Richard Hale was going to uncover it. His jaw set, his pacing stopped. Emily's life was too fragile for secrets, too precious for half-truths. He had lost too much already to pride and silence. This time, he vowed, he would face whatever Clara was hiding, even if the truth destroyed the last pieces of the family he thought he had left. Richard found Clara sitting in the waiting room, her shoulders slumped forward, eyes red and swollen from hours of silent tears. The fluorescent lights washed her face pale, making her look smaller, more fragile, not the confident, steady figure Emily clung to like a lifeline. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his resolve returned. He couldn't afford hesitation now. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Clara." His voice was sharp, though quieter than his usual thunder. "We need to talk, now." Clara stiffened, her back straightening as though bracing herself. For a heartbeat, she didn't look at him. Then she gave a small nod. He motioned toward a quiet corner of the hospital, away from the sterile buzz of nurses and restless families. She followed, her footsteps hesitant, like a child walking into a storm she could not avoid. Richard turned on her, his jaw set in stone. "I've had enough of secrets, enough of the whispers, the tears, the things you won't say. You've been overstepping with my daughter for months, and I let it slide. But no more." Clara's hands twisted together, knuckles white. Richard pulled the folded photograph from his pocket, holding it up like a weapon. "I found letters, a photograph, and tonight I heard you. In the chapel. I never wanted her to suffer like I did." "What does that mean, Clara?" His voice cracked with frustration. "What are you hiding from me?" "From Emily?" Her eyes darted away, fixating on the tiled floor as though it could swallow her whole. "Answer me!" He pressed, his tone hardening. "Tell me the truth. Who are you? Why are you really here?" For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant shuffle of nurses' shoes. Clara's lips trembled, but no words came. Her chest rose and fell quickly like a bird trapped in a cage. Richard's anger faltered under the weight of her silence. Beneath the fear in her eyes was something else, something raw, unspoken, almost unbearable. Finally, she whispered, her voice fragile but steady. "If I tell you the truth, you'll never look at me the same way again." Her words sent a chill down Richard's spine. He tightened his grip on the photo, his heart pounding. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he truly wanted the answer. For a long, suffocating moment, Clara said nothing. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her hands twisting in her lap as if she were wrestling with invisible chains. Then, with trembling lips, she finally whispered, "I didn't want you to find out like this." Richard leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Find out what?" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Emily, she's not just your daughter. She's my niece." The words slammed into Richard like a punch to the chest. He blinked, his world tilting. "You're... what?" Clara nodded slowly, her eyes glistening under the harsh hospital lights. "Her mother, your wife, was my sister." Richard staggered back a step, his disbelief flooding into anger. "That's impossible. My wife, she never mentioned—" "She wouldn't," Clara interrupted softly, her voice thick with grief. "Because she cut me off. She cut all of us off." Her words hung in the air, heavy, impossible. Richard's fists clenched. Why? Why would she keep something like this from me? Clara's lips quivered as memories flickered in her eyes. Because she was ashamed. Because she wanted to leave the past buried. And maybe because she thought you'd never forgive her if you knew the truth. About me, about us. Richard's chest tightened. A storm of emotions clawing inside him, confusion, betrayal, a strange ache he couldn't name. His wife had always been private, yes, but this? A secret sister? A hidden family? Clara's voice softened to a plea. I never came here to deceive you. I only wanted to protect Emily, to give her the love my sister never let me give. Please believe me, Richard. I never wanted to replace her mother. I just couldn't bear to lose her too. Richard's mind reeled. His entire reality tilted as the pieces of his life, his marriage, his grief, even Clara's devotion to Emily, shifted into a pattern he'd never seen before. For the first time, his anger faltered, but so did his certainty. Because if Clara was telling the truth, what else had his wife hidden from him? Clara's voice grew steadier, though her hands still shook as though every word cost her strength. My family. We weren't rich. We weren't powerful. We were black, working class, scraping to survive. Your wife, my sister, she fell in love with you, Richard. And the world she stepped into didn't want us in it. Not your circles. Not your family. So she made a choice. Richard's chest tightened, a faint ringing echoing in his ears. Memories flickered like fragments of a puzzle. His wife's distant silences, her careful avoidance of childhood stories, the way she always changed the subject when family came up. Her evasive smiles now screamed of something hidden. She married you, Clara continued, her eyes glistening. And in doing so, she left us behind. She told herself it was for love. But really, it was because she was ashamed. Ashamed of me. Ashamed of where we came from. The words were daggers, slicing through Richard's carefully constructed reality. He had always believed he'd known his wife fully, intimately. But now, hearing Clara, it felt as if he had been living with a stranger. Clara's voice broke, trembling between grief and defiance. When she died, I swore I wouldn't let Emily grow up the same way, cut off, blind to her roots, believing she had no one else. I couldn't let her live in a cage of silence, so I came here. I found a way in. Call me her maid, her nanny, her caretaker, whatever you want. But for me, it was never about the job. It was the only way I could keep my promise to my sister. Richard's throat tightened. His eyes fell to the floor, heavy with realization. A lifetime of questions pressed against his ribs. Questions his wife had taken to the grave. But beneath the shock, another thought coiled, darker, sharper. If Clara was right, then Emily carried a legacy he had never been told about. A legacy someone had tried very hard to bury. The silence between them deepened, not just tense, but dangerous. Because secrets like this never stayed buried without reason. Richard shook his head violently, as if trying to shake the words right out of the air. No, you expect me to believe this? That your family? That my wife would lie to me all those years? His voice cracked on the last word, a mixture of disbelief and fury. Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes, wet with unshed tears, locked firmly onto his. Not lie, hide, there's a difference. She loved you, Richard. But she knew the world you lived in. She knew how you'd react if she told you the truth. The words landed like a hammer against his chest. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He felt the sting of her accusation. His pride rising to defend him, even as something deeper, something he didn't want to name, whispered that Clara might be right. Richard's jaw tightened. She had no reason to hide anything from me. I gave her everything. A home, security, a life beyond what she could have imagined. Clara's voice softened, but it was sharper for it. And in return, she gave up everything else. Her name, her family, her past. All of it erased, because she knew if it followed her into this house, it would never be accepted. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Richard turned away, his shoulders stiff, his fists clenched at his sides. 1,000 memories swirled in his mind. His wife's nervous laughter when old. Friends asked about her childhood, the quiet sorrow in her eyes whenever Emily asked about Grandma and Grandpa. He had noticed. He had ignored it. Clara's whisper sliced through his thoughts. She was afraid, Richard. Afraid that the same prejudice that drove her away from us would one day touch Emily. She thought hiding the truth would protect her daughter. But in the end, it left Emily without half her family, without the roots that could have given her strength. Richard spun back toward Clara, his face pale with the weight of her words. He wanted to reject her claim, to bury it with anger and denial. But the cracks were already forming, widening with every second. And somewhere, beneath the storm of disbelief, another thought pressed forward like a shadow. If his wife had hidden this from him, what else had she hidden? Richard's mind spun back to the night that had ignited everything, the sight that had burned into him. Feeding his rage, Clara bent low, holding Emily close, whispering in her ear. That single image had been enough to unravel his trust. His voice now cut through the hospital quiet, sharp and raw. What were you saying to her? He demanded. That night, when I walked in, what did you tell my daughter? Clara's face softened, her eyes glistening. She didn't look defensive, only tired, worn from carrying a truth too heavy for too long. She was asking about her mother, Clara said gently. Emily wanted to know what she was like. She told me she wished she had someone, anyone, to tell her those little things. A daughter longs to know. So I gave her that. Richard froze, his throat tightening. Clara's voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of sincerity. I told her stories from when we were kids. How your wife was so stubborn she refused to lose an argument. How she used to braid my hair while we sat on the porch, laughing. How she loved to sing off-key in the mornings until the whole house groaned at her. A faint smile flickered through Clara's tears. I gave Emily pieces of her mother she could hold on to. Pieces you never knew to give. Richard's chest rose and fell unevenly, the truth pressing against his resistance. Clara's voice cracked. And then Emily cried. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, I love you, Mommy. She shut her eyes, her face breaking. She didn't mean to replace her mother. She wasn't trying to disrespect her memory. She just needed someone to fill the emptiness, someone who would listen. And in that moment, I couldn't pull away. She needed comfort. So I held her. Richard stood rooted, the echo of those words cutting deep. For the first time, his anger faltered, not gone, but shaken by doubt. And in the silence that followed, one haunting question remained. Was it betrayal he had witnessed that night? Or love? Richard staggered back, one hand clutching his forehead, as though trying to steady a world that had suddenly spun out of control. His chest tightened, breath shallow, as if the walls of the hospital themselves were closing in on him. The man who once commanded boardrooms with an iron voice now looked small, undone. Every memory replayed with brutal clarity, the cold glances, the sharp words, the suspicion that poisoned every interaction. He had built his case against Clara brick by brick, blind to the truth beneath his feet. Pride and prejudice had been his foundation, and now that foundation cracked, leaving nothing but regret. His voice broke, raw and unsteady, something rare for a man who never faltered. All this time. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. I thought you were trying to take her from me. Clara's tears glistened in the dim hospital light. She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling but firm. No, Richard, I wasn't trying to take Emily away. I was trying to give her what she was missing. The love, the stories, the pieces of her mother she never got to hold. What you couldn't see she needed. Her words sank deep, piercing the armor he had worn for so long. Richard's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He sank into a chair, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, the walls he had built, walls of authority, control, pride, cracked under the weight of his own failures. His voice came out barely above a whisper, choked with guilt. I failed her. I failed Emily. Clara knelt beside him, her presence gentle, not forceful. No, she said softly. You loved her. You gave her security, a future, everything you thought mattered. But children need more than protection. They need connection. They need the truth. Richard's eyes glistened, though he fought the tears threatening to fall. For a man who had spent his life in control, the loss of it felt like drowning. Yet within the suffocating guilt was something else, fear. Fear of losing his daughter. Fear of losing the only family he had left. And as he looked at Clara, one question consumed him, twisting his insides. Was it already too late to make things right? As dawn crept through the blinds, painting the sterile walls in pale gold, the soft click of the door broke the silence. A nurse slipped in, her face carrying a rare smile. She's awake. Richard's heart jolted. He and Clara rushed down the corridor and into the hospital room. Emily lay nestled among crisp sheets, her skin pale, her eyelids fluttering as though waking from a long dream. When her gaze finally found them, her lips parted. Daddy, she whispered, her voice fragile, yet more precious than anything Richard had ever heard. He stumbled forward, grasping her small hand with both of his throat tightening. It felt like holding the most fragile thread of life itself. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. His tears, unrestrained, slid down his cheeks. Emily's eyes shifted, landing on Clara, who lingered uncertainly near the door, as though she did not belong in this sacred moment. But Emily's voice broke through. Clara swallowed hard and stepped closer, her hands trembling. I'm here too, little one. A faint smile touched Emily's lips. When you hugged me, it felt like Mommy was still here. The words struck the room like a bell. Richard bent over his daughter, his chest heaving, tears spilling freely now. All his suspicions, all his walls, collapsed beneath the weight of that fragile truth. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, her own sobs shaking through her. For a moment, the three of them were bound together. Not by bloodlines or secrets, but by love, grief, and a child's fragile hope. But even as Richard wept, a shadow gnawed at the back of his mind. Emily had spoken of her mother as if she were near, as if Clara carried more of her within than just memories. And Richard couldn't escape the question, clawing at him. What else had been kept hidden? Days later, Emily was discharged, her small frame bundled in blankets as Richard carried her into the Hale mansion. The grand house, once suffocating with silence, seemed to breathe again. For the first time in years, Richard noticed the little things. The warmth of the fireplace, the faint scent of lavender from the garden Clara tended, the laughter that echoed faintly from Emily's room instead of dying in empty halls. The change was subtle but undeniable. Richard no longer barked orders at Clara or treated her presence as invisible. Instead, he watched. He listened. He saw the way Clara smoothed Emily's blankets, the way her voice softened when telling bedtime stories, and for the first time, he no longer saw her as an intruder or a servant. He saw her as family. One evening, as twilight painted the windows in shades of violet and gold, Richard found himself pausing at Emily's door. He heard giggles, then Clara's soft humming, a tune that tugged at memories of his late wife. He stepped inside quietly. Clara was sitting at the bedside, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead, her presence calm and nurturing. Emily's eyes lit up when she saw him. "Daddy," she said, her voice still weak but filled with hope. "Can we both hug her goodnight?" Richard froze. The request pierced straight through his pride. For a moment he almost turned away, but Emily's expectant gaze, so pure, so trusting, anchored him. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he crossed the room and knelt beside them. He reached out, wrapping his arms first around his daughter, then around Clara. The embrace was clumsy at first, stiff with years of distance and unspoken pain. But as Emily nestled between them, her small arms clinging tightly, Richard felt something shift deep within him. The cold walls he had built began to crumble. The mansion did not echo with emptiness that night. It pulsed with something unfamiliar, yet deeply needed, something warm, something alive. And yet, as Richard held them both, a flicker of unease stirred. Clara's presence filled the void his wife left behind too easily, too perfectly. Was this healing, or the beginning of a truth he still hadn't uncovered? Weeks passed, and with each sunrise the shadows in the Hale mansion thinned. Emily's color returned, her laughter echoing through corridors that had long been silent. The doctors called her recovery remarkable, but Richard knew it wasn't just medicine. It was love, the one thing he had neglected. But Clara had quietly nurtured all along. Clara filled Emily's evenings with stories, memories of a mother Emily had only known in photographs. She told her how stubborn she was, how she sang too loudly in the mornings, how she once braided Clara's hair only for it to come undone minutes later. Emily soaked it in, wide-eyed, piecing together a mother she could finally feel, not just imagine. And Richard learned, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. He learned that fatherhood was not measured in grand gestures or wealth, but in presence, in kneeling down to listen to his daughter's worries, in holding her hand when she woke from a nightmare, in letting his pride fall away so his love could finally take root. One evening, the three of them sat by the crackling fireplace, Emily curled between them, the flickering glow painting her face in soft light. She looked from Clara to Richard, her smile radiant, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," she said with a certainty far beyond her years, "I have a real family." Richard's eyes glistened. He pulled her close, his arms trembling but steady. Clara reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it gently, her own tears spilling quietly. For the first time in years, the Hale mansion no longer felt hollow. It pulsed with life, warmth, and the fragile beginnings of forgiveness. Yet somewhere in Richard's heart lingered a quiet question, one he had not yet dared to ask Clara aloud. What other truths still remain in the shadows? Sometimes the people we mistrust the most are the very ones sent to heal our brokenness. Richard thought he had caught betrayal. Instead, he found family. In Clara's loyalty and Emily's innocence, he discovered a truth deeper than wealth, stronger than pride and more enduring than legacy. Clips of Richard, Clara, and Emily together, once cold walls now echoing with warmth. Emily's laughter fills the mansion as Clara braids her hair. Richard joins them by the fireplace, and the three share a quiet embrace in the garden. What was once loneliness has been replaced by love. But what about you? What if you were Richard, blinded by pride, then faced with a truth you never expected? Would you have forgiven? Could you have opened your heart to the very person you once pushed away? The camera lingers on their shared smile, firelight glowing across their faces. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories with powerful twists, unforgettable lessons, and endings you'll never see coming.